What an exciting afternoon for Merritt College. My name is Deborah Jackson. I'm going to be your MC for this morning. I want to welcome everyone to Merritt College. I'd like to welcome our distinguished panel. I'd like to welcome all of our community members and our guests, and certainly our students at Merritt College. And our staff. And alumni. What an honor and a privilege, and quite befitting to host an event such as this today, the trailer about an upcoming film that focuses on the trial of the century, which is about the 1968 Huey Newton death penalty trial. And the reason that this is an honor and a privilege and quite befitting in this particular room today, not to mention all the other wonderful reasons, is because this room that we're in today is named the Huey P. Newton Bobby Seale Student Lounge. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you our president of Merritt College, Dr. Ambrose Galaviz.
First of all, I want to take a moment, and I do want to introduce one of our trustees that's here, Linda Henny. Did you want to say a few words of welcome?
President Ambrose Galaviz. Ladies and gentlemen, if I can have your attention for just a couple of minutes, I'd like to address a couple of housekeeping issues. For those of you who are not familiar with our campus, the restrooms are just down the hall beyond this glass atrium to my right. And at this time, I'd like you to take just a couple of minutes and reduce the volume on your cell phones. Would you please do that? So at this time, we'd like to hear some comments on the purpose of today's program, and Dr. Audrey Trotter will present that. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Audrey Trotter.
Thank you very much. I'm really doing this on the behalf of another trustee, and that's Attorney Meredith Brown, who is actually the trustee that serves the district of Merritt College. And our president alluded to the fact that there was an activity in the first week of October, and this is the follow-up to that activity. And what Trustee Brown brought to the Peralta district, she invited all of us to participate in the Trial of the Century project, which was meant to engage Peralta students and the wider Bay Area community in a discussion regarding the historical and political significance of the Huey Newton trial that you'll hear about today. The three trials that were debated the first week in October at Laney College, and you'll have to make a decision after today's presentation as well, which one was really the trial of the 20th century. Was it the Huey P. Newton trial? Was it the Angela Davis trial? Or was it the O.J. Simpson trial? Now that was the debate that was heard at Laney, but today we'll hear from Judge Pearlman, who has written a book, The Sky is the Limit, the Huey P. Newton trial versus all the others. and we'll draw our own conclusion. And then it's a real honor to participate in history. And you'll be participating in history today because we have our very own Professor Emeritus, the brother of Huey P. Newton, who will be serving our distinguished panel today, Melvin Newton. Trustee Brown is on her way, and you'll be able to hear from her by the end of the program. So without further ado, I'd like to ask our Mistress of Ceremonies to get us underway. Deborah Jacks, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Trotter. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce to you this distinguished panel that we have with us today. And I'd like to begin with the Honorable Judge, Lise Pearlman. Anyone fascinated by true crime and legal thrillers will want to read The Sky's the Limit, People versus Newton. The real trial of the 20th century. Well, is it? According to Dr. Trotter, we'll find out. In comparing the 1968 trial of Black Panther Party leader Huey Newton to other riveting American trials from 1901 to 1999, author Lise Pearlman revisits historic legal battles featuring murder, rape, kidnapping, skeletons in celebrity closets, class warfare, Fixing the World's series, evolution versus creationism, abuse of power, and political conspiracy. Each trial of the century serves as a window into its own era by the author, but the author asserts that Newton murder trial following a shootout with two Oakland policemen, where the accused revolutionary put American itself on trial for 400 years of racism, should head the list. It drew an international spotlight on a superpower rocked by two political assassinations, and bitterly divided over the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. At the time, the FBI considered the Black Panthers the greatest internal threat to American security. So did party spokesman Eldridge Cleaver, who threatened revolution if Newton were condemned to die. The author contends that the jury's surprising verdict still reverberates today. Had it turned out otherwise, Barack Obama would likely not be president. About the author, the Honorable Lise Pearlman was an undergraduate at Yale during the murder of the trial of Panther chairman Bobby Seale in New Haven, and has lived most of her adult life in Oakland, where in 1968 Huey Newton murder trial took place. She arrived in the fall of 1971 between Newton's second and third trials for the killing of Officer Fry. Now a retired judge, she practices as a mediator with the Alternative Resolution Center. Ladies and gentlemen, Honorable Judge Pearlman. Our next panelist is Mr. Robert Richter. Robert Richter directs, produces, writes, is the executive producer, and distributes documentaries on the human dimensions of the vital issues of our time. Since 1957, and issues often ignored by mainstream media. With passionate dedication, he has dealt with tough controversies, risking his career and sometimes his life, and his hard-hitting documentaries investigate governments, international agencies, and corporations. His documentaries have been telecast in prime time on HBO, PBS, CBS, NBC, ABC, TBS, Discovery, BBC, and many other major overseas television outlets. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Robert Richter. And last but not least, covering a span of 45 years with both Merritt College and the Peralta Community College District is Melvin Newton, Professor Melvin Newton, Professor Emeritus. Melvin Newton is the former chair of the African American Studies program and the former dean of 3 of the Peralta colleges. He's a former Black Panther and is the brother of Huey P. Newton. And so, ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I'd like to have the Honorable Judge, Lise Pearlman, and she will introduce to you the PowerPoint presentation.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you so
welcome.
much
You're
for
welcome.
that introduction. So if we can begin the PowerPoint. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because I want plenty of time for you to ask questions at the end. But what we're going to do with the PowerPoint is bring you back to 1967, 1968, and many of you for the very first time. I don't know how many of you saw the 68 exhibit at the Oakland Museum. Did any of you go to that? Maybe a few. They went through month by month what was happening in 1968, and I'm going to go through some of that. So let's get started. Okay, let's go to okay. So what preceded the Newton trial and what made it so significant is what was the turmoil that was going on in urban centers across country, and it started with the Watts riots in 1965 in Los Angeles. Go to the next slide. The following year, Stokely Carmichael, who was the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, split with Martin Luther King, who had founded SNCC, and decided that Black Power was the way to go and to be much more confrontational. This was June of 1966. Well, 2 young men who lived in this area read about Stokely Carmichael and a voting group that he had down in Alabama, which had the symbol of a Black Panther, and decided to form their own party, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Okay, so the program that Bobby Seale and Huey Newton founded was a 10-point program, and they had a few pointers from his older brother Melvin, especially on punctuation and things like that, I think. But in any event, we're not going to go through the whole program, but it was issues that had been bandied about in the black community for many years. It was issues of great concern that they didn't come up with on their own, but were already something that everyone wanted: full employment, decent housing, other issues. True education was number 5, and that's why this student lounge is dedicated to Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And that meant education from a different perspective, from the perspective of different ethnic groups and races rather than white male European. I don't need this, huh?
No, you do.
Okay.
But you need to talk more into it like that.
All right, I got it, thank you. If you can't hear me back there, please wave. Okay, so the one that made them stand out from other groups at the time was number 7. So let's go to the next slide. We want an immediate end to police brutality and murder. And we assert the Second Amendment rights of all black men to arm themselves for self-defense. And that's an issue that's come up again recently with the Florida Stand Your Ground laws and others. But this was what the Panthers stood for. Next slide. And the person who taught Huey Newton, taking a class here, and he took one in San Francisco on California criminal law, was Ed Meese, who later became the Attorney General of the United States under President Reagan. But Huey Newton took these courses so he knew when you could carry a loaded weapon, how you could carry a loaded weapon, and do it within the law at that time. Move to the next slide. In the spring of 1967, the Panther Party started its newspaper, which became the principal source of its income. And it started the paper over the killing of a young man in Richmond who was accused of being a fleeing felon, a suspect of a of stealing a car. That was what he was suspected of doing. And he was shot in the back and killed. And that was the policy that they followed in Oakland and Richmond and other places at the time, that police could shoot to kill someone who was suspected of being a fleeing felon. Well, the Panthers took that story and made it into their cause. And they went to Sacramento with several members of Denzel Dowell's family to protest a new change in the law that was about to occur. Why was it going to occur? Well, the Panthers were following the police around on their beat everywhere, in the flatlands, particularly in Oakland. And every time someone was about to get arrested, they would stop, come out with their guns, and Huey would go over and read to the policeman from his law book and tell them, this person has rights, and you have to read them their rights, all of that, which was something the police did not like one bit. So let's go to the next slide. So the Panthers went to Sacramento, and this is the first time they became internationally known. It was a huge debut because Huey didn't go with them because it was dangerous. He would probably have gotten arrested. But Bobby Seale led the faction of about 30. They were all dressed wearing jackets and berets and carrying guns, which was legal, with loaded guns, but you could point them straight up or straight down. And they went into the assembly in Sacramento to protest this new bill by a local assemblyman from here to prevent anyone from carrying a loaded weapon in any city limits across the whole state. And it was called the Panther Bill. And the legislature passed that bill. But the publicity that came out of that reverberated not only across the United States, but in London and other places as well. Who were these Panthers? What were they about? And at the Capitol, Bobby Seale read a statement that Huey Newton wrote about how the Panthers were against the colonial power of the United States being used not only here, but in the Vietnam War. And so they linked the two. Next slide. Okay, so that summer, there was a lot of protest in urban centers across the country. It had nothing to do specifically with the Panthers, but for similar reasons as the Panthers were formed. And so you had rioting in all of these cities. Next slide. So President Lyndon Johnson appointed a National Advisory Committee to figure out what happened, why it happened, and what could be done about it. Because this was occurring not only in the summer of '67, it had occurred in '66 and had gone back to Watts. What was going on and why? Okay. So then, let's go to the next slide. This, as I mentioned, this is in the middle of the Vietnam War. Men are getting drafted, coming home in body bags, getting injured, and it was a very unpopular war with American youth. Okay, so there was the induction center. It was the largest induction center on the West Coast in Oakland, and Berkeley was a center of anti-war protests. So Berkeley students and other activists came over and blocked the entrance to the induction center, thousands of them. And the police, the local police, Oakland, Berkeley, state police, and National Guard came and arrested them. So it was a huge confrontation during the Stop the Draft week. Next slide. Only 2 weeks later, there was a shootout early morning in Oakland. Huey Newton was wounded, an Oakland policeman was killed. These were the headlines. And Huey was immediately arrested and charged with murder. And what happened was, because it was in the context of this anti-war movement, there was already pending proceedings against 7 of the leaders of the Stop the Draft week. So a lot of the demonstrators came over to the Oakland courthouse to protest against the trial of those young men, and they also protested Huey Newton's trial. So it was a combination of the anti-war movement and people starting to come and be supporters of the Black Panthers. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is what they used. They went around trying to get everyone in the neighborhoods to support Huey Newton. Let's pull up the next one. And this is what they said. Can a black man get a fair trial in America defending his life against a white policeman? And then the last one for this slide. And that was the photo they used. If you look at the picture in the San Francisco Examiner, it's the same photo, but they cut off the policeman. This is the original photo, and the policeman's look like a deer caught in the headlights. Let's move on. Okay, so William Patterson, who was the head of the American Communist Party, happened to be visiting at the time in San Francisco with his friend Dr. Carlton B. Goodlett, for whom it's now Carlton B. Goodlett Plaza at San Francisco City Hall. It's named for him. But let's go back a sec. And he was the owner of a newspaper, San Francisco Sun-Reporter. They thought that this case involving Huey Newton had huge possibilities for embarrassing the United States. Next slide. So, if some of you may have heard of the Sacco and Vanzetti case, it was one of the most famous criminal trials in the American 20th century, in the 20s. And Patterson worked on the appeal in that case, where these 2 men were ultimately executed, and people across the world thought that they had not been fairly tried. But Patterson had been very involved in that case. Next one. He was also involved in the Scottsboro Boys cases in the 30s, which resulted in 2 very famous rulings. I'm just going to mention them briefly. The U.S. Supreme Court said for the first time that when you're entitled to an attorney, when your life is on the line in a death penalty case, that the attorney has to be competent. First time they ever said that was in this case. First time. And they also said that when you pick a jury panel, when the jury potential panelists come out, they have to be mixed race if that's the community that you're representing. You cannot have a jury panel, in this case in Alabama, that had been all white since everybody could remember. And so that was the other major ruling in this case. And Patterson had been involved in both of them. Okay, so here's Newton's legal team. Charles Gary was the lead attorney. He'd never lost a client to the death penalty. Faye Stender worked with him, and it was very unusual to have women sitting as a criminal defense lawyer. She sat second chair, and there's, of course, Huey in the middle. It was controversial among the Panthers to have white lawyers, but in fact, Bobby Seale endorsed this, and so did Melvin Newton, because Charles Gary was such an extraordinary lawyer, and partly because of the way they were willing to work, which was that fundraising could go on over time instead of asking for money up front. But go ahead. Kathleen Cleaver and Eldridge Cleaver were the primary spokesmen for this, spokeswoman, and they raised all kinds of money for the defense of Huey Newton. Eldridge had just gotten out of jail the year before and published his book, Soul on Ice. Okay, so what was California like back then? Well, you have to imagine, for some of you who weren't born by then, we had back that, go ahead, yeah. White male governors forever. Of course, we've never had a woman yet, or a governor of color. White males in every elective office, superintendent of schools, everything you could think of. And the news was, in the mainstream press, was all white male news. Okay, and this was still true in 1968. Yeah. Okay, Oakland in 68 had had white male mayors for its entire history, and for the last 50 years, the mayor was named by the Oakland Tribune. If the Oakland Tribune endorsed someone, that's who became mayor. And so they were all Republican mayors since 1915. And almost every city official was a white male. Okay. Okay. So in the Oakland Arena, there was a huge fundraiser. It's where the Warriors now play, but they weren't there yet. And they had the wicker throne, which is emblematic of Huey and was on all of the Black Panther newspapers. They put it up there empty because they thought he was going to be executed for this crime. They'd never heard of a black man accused of killing a white policeman who didn't get the death penalty. And so each of the speakers up there said in his own words, or sometimes in these very words, the sky's the limit. If he dies, we're going to retaliate. We're going to have guerrilla warfare across America. Okay. Then the Kerner report, which had been ordered the prior summer, came out. And it actually surprised a lot of people. It was very controversial. And it said we were moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And it was caused by white racism. Okay. So this divided a lot of people. And they made recommendations about housing and job training and education that actually mirrored a lot of what the Panthers had in their platform. Next slide. Then President Johnson, who had become very unpopular over the Vietnam War, announced he was not running for re-election, which was very shocking. And then within a few days, there was a much bigger shock. Martin Luther King was assassinated. There were riots in 125 cities. National Guardsmen called out everywhere. The Huey Newton trial was supposed to take place in May. It had to be postponed because of the turmoil and polarization in the community, particularly because of what happened 2 days after this. Next slide. Bobby Hutton, who was the youngest member and the first recruit by the Black Panthers, was killed by Oakland police, and they said they thought he was armed. He was unarmed, and that caused a huge division in the community. Actually, the police chief was very upset about this shooting because he did not like the shoot-to-kill policy of suspects anyway. He ended it right after the Hutton killing. Okay, and then in June, when the Newton trial was supposed to then take place in June, right before that, Bobby Kennedy gets assassinated in Los Angeles. Another huge impact on American society, and the trial gets postponed again. So these are all things that people are thinking about. Next slide. So meantime, the defense had been working hard to get this trial postponed because there were some major things happening in the courts. And I'm just going to mention three really briefly. The U.S. Supreme Court said for the first time in a death penalty case that if you don't like the death penalty as an average citizen, you think it's probably not good policy, you can actually sit on a death penalty case if you promise that you can uphold the law, if you could apply it if need be. Up until then, you were automatically excused. So the only people who sat on death penalty cases were people who liked it, okay, and were more prone to convict. All right, next, okay. They also, click it again. In Alameda County, two things happened. One of them was that there was an IQ test for jurors that was given up until April of 1968. And that IQ test was culturally biased. It would ask questions like if you're going on your way to the doctor and it's raining, should you take an umbrella, wait an hour, or cancel the going? And they didn't even ask, is this an appointment? Or is this maybe a clinic? Or maybe you have to go to the emergency room because you can't afford those. Oh, do you have pneumonia? I mean, there are reasons why you might wait an hour. There are lots of reasons. Maybe you don't even own an umbrella. So the judge threw out that set of questions. Over 80% of people who lived in the Oakland Flatlands did not pass that IQ test, whereas only 14% in the hills flunked it. So it was very divisive in terms of who wound up on the jury. It was knocked out in April before the Newton trial. And one other, the week before the Newton trial, hit it again, there was a local judge who said that a prosecutor unfairly prosecuted a case, and it was a mistrial, because the defendants were black, and every black potential juror was excused by that prosecutor. There's two levels. There's one is the panel composed of people that are a cross-section? Then how do the lawyers pick who gets on the actual jury? And you have a certain number of challenges you can do for any reason or no reason, but this judge said you can't do it for race reasons. And the U.S. Supreme Court actually said that 18 years later, but not then. And so that was very important to the Newton trial. Okay. Meanwhile, Peace and Freedom Party is running Eldridge Cleaver for president, Huey Newton for Congress, and Kathleen Cleaver for assembly. And all those stickers and all that's going on in the community at the same time. Next slide. Okay. Well, Huey Newton was being prosecuted, people versus Newton. That's how criminal trials work. And he was saying, I represent the people, power to the people. What did he mean by that? Well, he actually had a huge array of supporters. Coalition of anti-war, people, black militants, radical young whites, the Communist Party, the black community with all the years of grievances that were built into the Panther Party platform, white liberals who appreciated the Kerner Report, and religious organizations, especially around the free breakfast program that the Panthers started. So you had a lot of people, when he said power to the people when he walked into the courtroom, that actually that supported him. Okay, so the ingredients for what I consider to be the trial of the century come from a definition by a man named J. Anthony Lucas, who is a journalist with the New York Times and historian. A spectacular show trial, a great national drama, one in which the stakes are nothing less than the soul of the American people. And I think this case met that test. Okay. So one of the things that came out of this case also is that in the process of picking who would serve on the jury, Charles Gary exercised a technique that most lawyers didn't use, and he wound up getting the judge to excuse a lot of people who thought they were fair-minded but actually exhibited bias. And that's a tricky and hard thing to do. He did it. Every technique that he used and the arguments they made were put in a book called Minimizing Racism in Jury Trials and used by defense lawyers across the country for years to come. So it had a very powerful impact. What was the result of all that work that they did? The result of his work was this jury did not look like I don't know if you've ever seen the movie with Henry Fonda, 12 Angry Men, but in the 50s, that's what a criminal jury looked like, white men. This jury in the 60s was different than most juries across country. It had a majority of women, it had 4 minorities on it, and there was 1 African-American man who made it onto a death penalty case, probably one of the first ever in the country to do so in a major case, and the jurors chose him as the foreman. Nobody has ever heard of a black foreman of a death penalty case before this case. Okay, so that's who you get, and that was the process by which they got there. Okay, moving on. Okay, the prosecutor was D. Lowell Jensen. He's now a federal judge. He was actually extremely fair-minded. The defense was very impressed with him. He had challenges he could use. They each had 20, both sides. The defense used every single one of theirs to try to get a fair-minded jury. He left a half a dozen in his pocket. He did not use them all. He left minorities on that jury. He left it with more women than men because he thought they could be fair. And he was very unusual as a prosecutor in that day. Okay, so in the meantime, people are demonstrating in the streets, power to the people, and around the courthouse. High security, first time ever, Alameda County Courthouse, because of all the demonstrations. J. Edgar Hoover at that point, as was mentioned, said the Panthers are the #1 internal threat to American security. So this was a very much watched trial. Okay. One of the people who was an observer is a man named Gilbert Moore. He was sent there by Life magazine, African-American who grew up in Harlem, and then in high school he was in Jamaica. And he came out and he became so fascinated that he stayed longer than the Life magazine expected him to. He quit his job and wrote a book called A Special Rage because it tapped into his own anger watching this Newton trial. Okay, and just the last week of the trial, the Democratic Convention in 1968 was happening, and because of all the anti-war protesters, there was a lot of confrontation going on with the Chicago police. And the police were bashing heads not only of demonstrators, but of journalists, and it was all over TV internationally as well as throughout the U.S. And Newton's lawyer, Charles Gary, referred to this in closing argument. You see those Chicago police on TV? The Oakland police were just the same. They were abusive to Huey Newton. That's what started this. So that was what they said, and they did say at that point, the whole world is watching, like Occupy says now. Okay? So the day before the verdict, the Panther newspaper came out, said, "World awaits verdict, free Huey, or the sky's the limit." Next Okay, so this raises a question that I refer to in my book in a number of places about what makes our society a great society. What makes it a true representative democracy? And what all of them say is that when you go to your criminal trials and you look at them and you see who gets prosecuted, the most vilified, the ones who have the least power in the society, how do you treat them? If you treat them fairly, then you have a good society. And that Booker T. Washington was one of the first that I heard speak about that publicly, that read about that he had said publicly, because in 1901, the president, McKinley, was shot by a man at a fair, in an exposition, standing in line, everyone was shaking hands, and he pulled out a gun and he shot the president. And they wanted to lynch him. This was in New York State. Okay, it wasn't in the South. It was in New York State, 1901. And Booker T. Washington went public and said, no, even the most vilified person deserves a fair trial. And what he was hoping to do was to educate America not to engage in the rampant lynching that was going on in that era. Not only in the South, but some here in the West and in other places. And so he saw it as a teaching opportunity. Yes. Okay, so the ingredients for a fair trial for a black revolutionary in America in 1968, extraordinary defense team. They put on a movement political defense. They put America on trial. They turned the tables. Witherspoon, a landmark ruling about death penalty jurors who could sit, much broader number of minorities than women. The IQ test was thrown out. You had this ruling that you could not challenge on the basis of race. The prosecutor couldn't do that. You had a very fair-minded prosecutor. You had a very fair-minded judge who let Huey get on the stand and talk about 400 years of racism. You had a courageous jury foreman, a banker named David Harper, and the whole world watching a spectacular show trial that tested the soul of the American people. One more slide. The unsung hero who I met just this summer is David Harper, who is the retired banker who served on that trial. He's now 80, and he's going to be featured in the trailer we're about to show you.
We're at the point in the program where we'd actually like to hear some comments from the panelists. And after that, ladies and gentlemen, there is a mic in the middle of the floor if you'd like to come up and ask questions of the panelists.
First, I want to thank you guys for this presentation. It's not so much of a question I want to ask because I was a kid at the breakfast program at St. Patrick's Elementary School. I was raised up up under the Black Panthers and what you stood for when you brought to our community. And this is interesting. You brought this to the forefront because the young generation here needs to know where their roots came from, where we are right now, and still fighting for. And I commend you guys for bringing this to the forefront. Also, I was a child at the Infirmary Park when Robert Kennedy came to the Infirmary Park. And there's one thing that the Panthers brought to West Oakland was it brought a sense of security for all the kids and all the people that lived there, me being one of them. They emphasized and advocated education. It was powerful to people. It was black businesses owned by black people, houses owned by black people, education for black people, and hospitalization for black people in our community. That's how we got the West Oakland Health Center. That's how we got a lot of different things there. And it's not enough that can be said about what the Black Panther Party has done in West Oakland. And I commend you guys for bringing that message to the world.
But the impact, I think, of both Martin Luther King's assassination and his trial and its outcome, and that it did not result in riots across the country, helped lay the groundwork. So Bobby Seale ran for mayor in 1973 and got over 40% of the vote. The Panthers put their efforts, political efforts, behind Lionel Wilson, became only the second black mayor on the West Coast. And you saw mayors being elected in urban centers across America. So the people were coming together more in the next 2 decades, which laid the groundwork for being able to elect Obama.
Okay, thank you, and a shout out to Huey, because he came up on 10th Street University as well. Okay.
My name is Merritt College, and I was a student in St. Patrick's. I went to school and was a breakfast program leadership of Clarence Howard, which was the priest at that time. And my question is to Mr. Newton. Was it true at that time that they put Maryland down in West Oakland to participate the Black Panther in 1967 and 1968? They put Maryland down in West Oakland around 14 around all the way through West Oakland to destroy the movement of the Black Panther.
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. I really don't know.
But you being,
I do know that in the early 80s, we started to get a proliferation that went throughout the community and contaminated much of our youth and our population, and that this has continued, but it was destructive to families. It wasn't cut off. The peculiar thing about the whole drug thing is that we don't, most of the people who this affect don't own ships and airplanes, etc., that brings the stuff in. And little people who are doing it on the street corners really cannot be solution to the problem, no matter what you do. It's bigger than that. So I can't say that I have expertise in that.
How y'all said about having the first black president, do you think that he's doing something right now since it's still changed to go right now? Do you feel like for us electing him, did he do enough, or is he doing things that will change our community?
Who's that directing that?
It don't matter. Exactly.
Who wants to take that? You want to come again on that?
I said, since we have a first black president, do you think that since we have so much change to go in our community and in the United States in general, do you think that Barack Obama is doing enough, or is he doing anything at all to help in the black community or what?
That's an interesting question, and it goes deep into a lot of directions. Barack Obama is a president who happens to be black. Barack Obama does not have a black agenda, although he has a black history. He also has a white history. He's known to be white. Anyone who's president of the United States may go in being who they are, but once they're inaugurated, when they wake up the next morning, they're the president of the United States. Which reminded me of a remark Huey made to David Tilley. David Tilley once mentioned to Huey how well he knew him, and said, I really know this guy very, very well. Huey's response was, don't say that, because person that goes to bed at night as me is not the person that wakes up in the morning as that same person. So when the president wakes up in the morning, he wakes up as a president who has to deal with the Congress and has to deal with the entire world. And the things that we have to do as black people is not sit down and rely on Barack Obama to be the person that carries the black agenda or even addresses them. If we have things that need to be addressed, we go after him just as we go after any president, white or otherwise, and bring our agenda and put the heat under that president to represent us in the areas that we want to be represented. We cannot. What Lyndon Baines Johnson told Dr. King, when Dr. King was persistent in pushing the civil rights movement before the civil rights bill was passed, he wanted him to slow down. King could not do that, of course, made it clear that he couldn't. So what Lyndon Baines Johnson said then, well, okay, brother, you go out there and make me do it. So my answer to that is whatever we need and what we want, we have to go out there and make it do it.
One of them is that by being elected, Barack Obama also faced an historic backlash, more death threats than any other president, and a backlash because he's part African American. And that has made it much more difficult for him in the White House. But one thing that Maury Turner told us, I don't know if you know the international syndicated cartoonist who we have is from Oakland, Maury Turner, but we interviewed him for this film yesterday. One of the things he says, he loves going into schools and help with all kinds of school programs with young kids. And he says the first time ever after Barack Obama's election that he internalized the possibility that yes, any one of you can be president, and how the kids responded. Yes, that symbolism is now there. It's possible.
Hello, how you doing? My name is Arnie Story, and you're the educator. I was next year, and I was told that college success class, and I was told to find out who you guys information to give us. So, when you guys were doing your thing, the next time I was a little girl, so I might not look like there, right? I want to know, what are your names again? Who are you again?
Director Bob Richter,
Okay.
director of the film that we're making.
Okay.
Professor Melvin Newton, who's a Professor Emeritus of Merritt.
Okay.
And myself, I'm a retired judge, Lise Pearlman.
Okay, so I'm going to be part of the secret. And what can I do to be a part of continuing education?
Well, we're hopeful that when this film gets made, and it's intended to be a nonprofit educational film that is used in high schools and colleges across the country. We have to raise the money first. But once we do, we want to start dialogues going so people see this history and recognize that in your own generation there are all kinds of issues. And what they did, they were social activists who risked their lives to make progress. And everyone acknowledges that without the Panthers, Martin Luther King would not have been as listened to as he was. He was considered more of a voice of reason by the people he was dealing with, and before that, he was the enemy. So there was a huge effect beyond what the Panthers were doing directly on how other people in the political world were perceived and the progress that we made. So it's something we can all learn over and over again about how we can make progress on the issues that face us. Thank you.
Yes, I want to, first of all, acknowledge say I appreciate the presentation. It's excellent and it's powerful. For me, the Panther history has its effect today. With certain organizations adopting some of the principles and some of the bylaws of the Panthers. So my question is this. There's an organization or a group who considers itself the new Panther. Can you speak about that group and its relevance to the old Catholic?
My understanding is this very small group, and that's what I read, was based in Dallas, Texas. It was formed in about 1989 and has been totally disavowed that they can relate to the head of the Huey Newton Foundation as having absolutely no connection to the Black Panther Party. Would Barack Obama have been assassinated if he were affiliated with the Black Panther Party? No, like if he were affiliated with more like the Black community. More with Black men. I don't think that he probably would have been nominated if he were too closely affiliated with just one segment of society, which in that case would be the Black community. I think that what he did when he spoke at the Democratic Convention and became famous as a senator was talk about it's not a Black America, it's not a white America, it's one America. It's not red, it's not blue, it's one America. And that was what made him famous and made him a candidate. So I think it would be who he is. He sees himself as a mediator, as someone who represents everyone.
Would he have been a nominee if he was more like Martin Luther King? If it's the work of Martin Luther King, you think he would have been a nominee?
I'll address your question in continuation of what you raised. Jesse Jackson didn't get elected. He ran for president. He had pretty much Black agenda. And the question is absolutely not. We have work. The interesting thing about Barack, and I'm glad to see Barack in the position, because he is a symbol that my grandchildren don't think of him as being anything special other than being president. And that's good, because they just say that, oh, he's the president, which means to them that anybody who even look like him can be the president. That's the first thing. But when Barack ran for president, he ran from us. When I say us, I mean Black people. He ran for president. He ran away from us. He avoided answering questions that would tie him to kinship to Black people. He disavowed his father, who may have deserved that, but I'm not to judge that. And he celebrated his mother and his grandparents and his children celebrated. But I would like to say that even though his father appeared to have not been responsible and seemed not to have been there, his mother seemed to have been on a trip around the world too, because she was there and wasn't there at the same time. But yet he celebrated that in a way that brought him closer, and he wanted to make sure that he was not a threat to white people. And if he had not done that, he would not have become president. But I say the facts are the facts.
To the panel, thank you so much for joining us today. To the students, and please remain seated. To our students, thank you for being here. To our faculty members and community members, trustee. I'd like to mention at this time that Judge Pearlman's book is available in the back room for sale, and she will be here for a few minutes to actually autograph those books. So we want to encourage those of you who would like to get a copy to do so before you leave the room. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to turn the mic over to our president, Dr. Ambrose Galaviz.
I want to point out something that I omitted early in the program. I'm quite fascinated with some of the historical pictures of during the trial and during the time of the Black Panther. We have a special guest Ms. Hartman in the back, you can wave your hand in the back. She actually has some some photography, photo display at the law library. And she was kind enough to bring some of those. If you have a chance to go over to her table, they are very authentic. You can see the realism, the facial expressions of the individuals at that time. So, Ms. Hartman, thank you for bringing those pictures. And they are available online on her website if you want to take a look at them, right? Lastly, I want to thank the individuals that helped organize this event, okay? This fabulous event